In this presentation, we will talk about tips and strategies for communication skills. Listening is an important communication skill, and you really can't focus on what your reaction is to what's being communicated. If you're really going to be an effective and active listener, you need to pay attention to what's being said, and you need to do so with full focus. Unfortunately, we confuse hearing and listening. Haphazardly, we hear things. We walk into a room, we have the TV playing in the background when we're studying. So it's accidental, it's non intentional. Whereas when you're listening to something, you're focusing, you're paying attention, and again, you have that purposeful action, that intention to understand what is being said or what you're hearing, maybe in a presentation. Unfortunately, we sometimes experience obstacles to listening, and they can be external, which can be a lot of the noises in our environment around us, but often it's the chaos of the voices in our head. And those come from our perceptions, our ideas, the way that we process what's coming in. So it could be anything from our judgments to a lot of things being on our mind to thinking that we know what the person is already going to say and trying to anticipate that. So we really can get in our own way when we're trying to listen. When you go to the doctor, you don't say, "Hi, I'm here because I'm sick." You give a list of symptoms, you describe them in detail, you explain how long you've been feeling that way, and you give as much specific detail as you can to help the doctor make a diagnosis. Let's take the example of a student who missed a homework assignment with a teacher. The student leaves a message on the instructor's email or phone saying, "Hi, I missed last night's assignment. I was wondering if I could turn it in late. Get back with me as soon as possible." That's a pretty vague message. That instructor might be teaching multiple sections, so it's going to take a little bit of legwork for that instructor to figure out which class you're in. You didn't explain which assignment, so now that instructor has to try to guess which assignment you're referring to, especially if multiple assignments were due at the same time. You don't explain your circumstances, so was it a situation that was extenuating that prevented you from being able to turn your work in on time? Also, you don't explain how much of an extension you might need, a couple of hours, a day, a week. It's very difficult for that instructor to make an informed decision because you didn't communicate effectively and give specific details to assist that message being received and processed. The same holds true in a classroom environment. Instructors aren't psychic. They don't know if you're confused, if you don't understand, if you want to add something to the conversation. If you don't, raise your hand or make yourself heard. Oftentimes, students will say that they're embarrassed or humiliated to ask questions in class, but that's the whole reason that you're here is to learn. And you've probably experienced that when one person asks a question, other students chime in as well because all of a sudden they feel it's a safe environment. So again, make sure that you're communicating in your classroom settings so that your instructor can really understand where you might have some concerns or there needs to be some more clarity. In terms of the self-talk, like the inner critic and inner defender and inner guide, it carries over not only in the way that we perceive ourselves, but also in the way that we communicate. When we placate, What we're really doing is letting that inner critic take over in that victim mentality, and we're trying to be the people pleaser. We don't want to get someone upset or mad at us. We don't want to create a conflict, a controversy. We don't want to get into any kind of back and forth where someone might feel lesser of us. We assume responsibility that really isn't ours, and we take on the responsibility of others because, again, we don't want that confrontation. So we may say things like, "Oh, I'm sorry I'm bothering you," or, "Oh, it's okay, don't worry about it, I'll do it," or things like, "Oh, I should have done that," or "Please don't be upset with me." You're trying to avoid that conflict and that confrontation. What we have to remember to do is to feel self-esteem, confidence, to be assertive, and to not only think and feel it, but to say it, that I'm not going to do this. That's not my responsibility. You need to take care of this and take control of the situation. When we blame other people or make other excuses, the inner defender's taking over. And again, that's the same victim mentality. And really what we're doing is we're protecting ourselves from disappointment or failure because we're trying to make other people responsible for the situation. So we assign blame to others. So things like, no one ever told me I needed to do that or meet that deadline, or when are you going to start holding your weight? Or my instructor is unfair. Each one of those kinds of things, when you use that language, especially when you're using it one-on-one with someone, you're creating an antagonistic situation and effective communication gets lost. You also start putting a strain on that relationship. We often think that we're communicating well, and others who are confused are simply confused. It's their problem. Sometimes we need to look inward. We need to be flexible and adaptable and recognize that we need to communicate in different ways so that we're better understood. As a teacher, I constantly am using different ways to explain a similar concept because people come in with different skill levels, different backgrounds and experiences. So they might not get a reference that I use, or maybe they don't understand a concept with the vocabulary that I use. So in order to be best understood, you sometimes have to be adaptable. When you can reach the level of communication where you can level, you're really in touch with your inner guide who has that accountability and the plan of action. You can be reasonable, you can be responsible, and you really have that rational perspective of, okay, here's the situation. It might not have been the way that I wanted it to be, but this is how I'm going to approach it. And that same holds true the way that you communicate that situation with another person as well. So you really need to think about communicating purposefully so that someone really understands you. The example from the email to the instructor: "Hi, unfortunately, my car broke down yesterday and I wasn't able to make it to the computer lab. I don't have a computer at home. I missed the deadline. I'd like to talk to you about possibly submitting the assignment late. Would you be able to give me a call back so that we could discuss this further?" That gives a lot more information to that instructor, and you're communicating purposefully. You're also being honest with your communication. And even though that other person might be upset by what you say or might not agree with what you say, you're being honest about that communication. And again, you're being responsible. You take ownership for what's not only being said, but to how that situation came to be in the first place. A situation is just that, a situation. It is in and of itself equal on all counts. The difference comes into play when you have people with different perceptions, ideas, opinions, emotions, etc. So remember that the way that you react to a situation and the words, the language, the body language, the reactions that you have are things that you can control that might affect the overall outcome in reaction to that situation. When we talk about demands and requests, it's similar to the description of being aggressive versus assertive. When you're making a demand, you're being aggressive. Demands have expectations tied to them. There's an implication that in that moment, your needs are more important than someone else's. And they can trigger anger, hurt, anxiety, and antagonism in the other person that you're talking to, which is really blocking effective communication. Really, that whole idea of control can result in half-hearted efforts, in resentment or resistance on the part of the other person. There's not a whole lot of willingness to want to help you when you're stating demands. Whereas when you're talking about a request, you really are asking for the consideration of options, alternatives, ways to solve a problem. So you're much more likely to hear yes from someone when you're making a request because you genuinely are saying, hey, I contributed to this situation, but you know what? I really would like to have this outcome. Can we come to any kind of agreement to get there? So really think about when you're communicating with someone, are you barking demands at them or are you politely making requests? Turn the tables. If you were being asked, would you find that demand or that request reasonable? Would you find it appropriate, effective? How would you respond if that was being asked of you? Sometimes when you react to a situation, you want to count to 10 because you're upset, you're angry, you're feeling impulsive. Just like sometimes they tell you to count to 10, maybe if you look at the situation and you kind of break it down into these pieces, it can help you a little bit. So get in the habit of trying to take a situation, dissect it, and break it into these pieces and parts. So state the situation, have a statement of your reaction, a request, and an invitation to respond. So you can say things like, if we use the homework example again, we can say something like, when you had the deadline set for last night, I thought I would reach the due date, but a circumstance arose. I thought I would be able to make it, but when my car broke down, I couldn't get to the computer lab. I'd like to ask for a 1-week extension to submit my homework. Is that reasonable? Can you work with me on that? If you explain it that way to an instructor, they're going to have enough information to either make a denial and explain why they're denying you, or approve it and give you whatever conditions they think are reasonable for the situation. So remember, when you're talking about communication overall, you not only want to make sure that you understand what other people are saying, but that you're effectively and clearly communicating your thoughts, ideas, and perceptions, and always remember to be a good listener.